The Shemitah discussions are a bit behind us, so we pick up with the Mishnah. So quite interestingly, we spent the whole parak discussing the objects of the lulav and the esrog, and then where you would do the shaking at Hallel and so on, and finally at the end, then even special cases of the Shemitah case. And then finally, we get to the issue of what actually is the nature of the obligation. So in the originally, the lulav was taken in the Beis Hamikdash for all 7 days, and in the Medina for 1 day. Now, what's the Medina? So presumably, in contrast to the Mikdash, it means anywhere outside of the Beis Hamikdash. However, interestingly, Rambam in Perish Mishnayos in this case, and in one or two other cases, when there's Mikdash is contrasted to Medina, says that it refers to outside of Yerushalayim. That Mikdash really means anywhere within Yerushalayim. So, for example, you have a similar Mishnah that they would blow the lulav. That was not meant as permanent. That was just a misspeak. Right, exactly. They would blow the shofar in Rosh Hashanah that fell out on Shabbos in the Mikdash, but not in the Medina. And for the Rambam, that includes not only the Mikdash, but also Yerushalayim. But here as well, he understands that it means the Mikdash and Yerushalayim. Most, of course, understand that it means literally just the Mikdash and outside of the Mikdash. So 7 days in the Mikdash. Why? Based on the verse that says, take for yourself on the first day. So that's day one. It's a day one mitzvah. And then the end of the verse says, rejoice before Hashem your God for 7 days. So there's a 7-day mitzvah that is understood to also be a mitzvah of the lulav, and that is lifnei Hashem Elokechem, in front of Hashem your God, which means in the Beit HaMikdash, or according to the Rambam, the Mikdash and its environs, Mikdash and Yerushalayim. But that is 7 days. So originally it was a 7-day mitzvah in the Mikdash and outside of the Mikdash for 1 day. Once the Beis Hamikdash was destroyed, Rabbi Yochanan Zakkai said that the lulav should be taken all 7 days, not just out, everywhere, because now it would never be taken in the Mikdash for 7 days because there was no longer a Mikdash. So take it everywhere for 7 days. Zeichel Mikdash, as a way to remember the Beis Hamikdash. And Yom Hanaf, the day of the waving of the Omer, Kulo Asur should be fully forbidden. So it's quite fascinating. Why are we mentioning the bringing of the Omer, the waving of the Omer? But Tosfos says, well, maybe these two were sort of said at the same time. There's a lot of takanot that Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai made, Zeichel and Mikdash. These are only two of them. These are the two that are mentioned in our Mishnah. So let's take a look at the Gemara. The Gemara, interestingly, completely ignores the fascinating point about the lulav. Is it a 1-day mitzvah or a 7-day mitzvah? In a way, that'll get discussed in the beginning of the next parak. And it jumps totally just to the idea of Zeichel and Mikdash. Minola and Davdin and Zeichel and Mikdash, says the Gemara. Where do you get this idea that you should do something to remember the Beit HaMikdash? Amar Rabbi Yochanan, Amar Rabbi Yochanan says, because the verse says, Ki ele arucha lecha umimakotecha erpa'echa, because I will raise up a healing, like for you, and from your wounds I will heal you. Ne'um Hashem, says God, ki nidachai kar'ulach, because a castaway they have called you. Tzion he, it is Zion, doresh ein la, nobody seeks after it. So like bemoaning the fate of Jerusalem after the Chorban. So it says nobody is seeking after it. Doresh ein la, nobody is seeking after it. Michlal d'boy drisha, that we should be seeking after it. We should be things to remember the Chorban of Yerushalayim. I just want to say, this is a larger discussion, but I wrote an article once, which to me is I was surprised that nobody had ever said it before, but I think it's a profound appreciation of what Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai is doing. We always talk about Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai being concerned about the Chorban Habayis and making sure that it's in the forefront of our consciousness and so on. But first of all, Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai, if you think about it, was the one that actually helped the Jewish people at the wake of the Chorban transition away from a Chorban, from a Mikdash-centered Judaism to a Torah-centered Judaism. Right? He was the one that, according to the Midrash, went out to make a peace with Vespasian, and he said, the whole story in the Gemara Gittin, I'm not saying it's historical, but my concern is more the message of it, that Vespasian at the end of it says, ask for me one thing and I'll give it to you. And he says, give me Yavne and its wise men. And then Rabbi Akiva said, oh, he was so stupid. He should have asked to save Yerushalayim. And the Gemara says, he figured that was a lost cause. And if he asks for that, it's not going to happen. So he might as well ask for Yavne, which to me is a perfect distillation of two different approaches. Like one is always bemoaning the Mikdash and the Chorban of the Mikdash. And even at the last minute, even when it's already still a lost cause, all you can think about is what are we going to do to save the Mikdash? And completely is looking at that. And once the Mikdash is, of course, destroyed, then it focuses on the absence of the Mikdash. Whereas Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai was able to have the foresight to know when it was time to cut your losses and to move forward and to take a new tack and a new approach. And let's not be focused on the past and on the Mikdash, and let's figure out what we're doing to move forward, and let's focus on Yavne and like a Torah-centered Judaism. And it plays out in other ways as well. The famous story where, they're walking by Yerushalayim and they see the foxes coming from Har Abayis, and Rabbi Akiva laughs, and they say, why are you laughing? And Rabbi Akiva says, well, once the prophecy that the Mikdash would be destroyed was fulfilled, and the foxes were going to go on Har Abayis, I know that in the end, the prophecy that will be rebuilt will also be fulfilled. Okay, which is very nice, which is a very positive and optimistic view, but it still focuses on the fact that, we're going to get the Mikdash again, that the Mikdash is still very central, as opposed to a similar story with Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai that's reported in Avos to Rabbi Nosson, where they're walking by the Har Abayis and they see the Beis HaMikdash is destroyed, and Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai is laughing. And his students are crying, say, well, why are you laughing? And it says, well, what? Do you think like all we have is the Mikdash? Oh, yeah, it's better than my gospel. All we have is the Mikdash, as a way of worshiping God. We have other things that are equal to the Mikdash, because the verse says, because the verse basically says, I want your chesed chafatzti v'lo zavach. I want your loving kindness, not your sacrifices. And we have prayer and we have Torah and Maisim Tovim, which God wants, more than the sacrifices. So again, the end point being not that we have things that somehow are a substitute and the Mikdash is all that it's about, and these are somehow make up for it, but there actually is a different way of focusing where our sort of center of religious practice should be. So Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai actually is quite interesting. So if you think about that, and then you think that he's the one that does Zeichel HaMikdash, it's a little funny, except that his Zeichel HaMikdash, and this is sort of my thesis, is actually has the opposite effect of what it ostensibly comes to do. It ostensibly comes to help remind us of the Beis HaMikdash and the loss of the Beis HaMikdash. But if I went around to you today and said, why do we take the lulav for 7 days? What would your answer probably be? The answer would probably be, what do you mean, why do we take it for 7 days? It's a mitzvah to take the lulav for 7 days, right? It's not like taking it on the other days makes us remember, we're doing this to remember that we used to have a Beis HaMikdash, and actually, maybe you think about that when you do the Hoshanas and Hoshana Rabbah, but when you actually do this for 7 days, it actually makes you think that, who needs the Beis HaMikdash? We actually have a 7-day mitzvah of taking the lulav. So it actually has the opposite effect. Rather than heightening the loss of the Mikdash and reminding us of the Mikdash, it actually creates an expanded religious experience in the absence of the Mikdash, right? So it actually has quite, the opposite effect. That's actually, if you go through the various takanot of Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai that are sort of ascribed, given the purpose, said to be for the purpose of Zeichel HaMikdash, the real effect that they have is to create a vibrant, and in a way almost like a more vibrant, because now everybody is doing it, it's not just being done in the Mikdash by a few people, Judaism in the absence of the Mikdash. And we retain the vibrancy, even in its absence. So I think that there's a very sort of powerful idea behind Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai and his relationship to the Mikdash and the effect that these takanot had. Yes?
I actually think that there's even a deepened impact of this theology when one does know that it's a Mikdash, which is from Yochanan Zakkai found a way to institute phenomenologically that the yearning for the Mikdash is a substitute for its actuality. And it's a more powerful religious motivator to yearn for something, knowing implicitly that it would be better that it not be materialized.
All right, that's interesting.
The flip side, all right?
All right. Something. Okay. Anyway, that's an interesting point. So I actually think that my approach is a little different. My approach is that the effect of taking the lulav 7 days doesn't cultivate a sense of yearning for the mikdash. It actually supplants any sense of mikdash. So I actually think it's quite different. But okay, let's take a look. So that is a zeichel mikdash. No discussion about the actual idea of lulav 1 and 7. We'll discuss that more in the next parak. Yom hanaf kulo asur. The day of the waving of the omer should be fully forbidden. Now, what's the story? The story is that you cannot eat the new grain until the omer is brought the second day of Pesach. Ad yom aviyachem korban lokechem, until you bring your korban, the omer. What if no korban is brought? So the assumption is if there's not going to be a korban because there's no Beit HaMikdash, it actually becomes permissible at the beginning of the day until the essence of this day, which is understood to mean until the day begins. So ironically, if there's no Mikdash, it's permitted as soon as the day 16th of Nisan begins. If there is a Mikdash, it's only permitted once the Omer is brought. So why did he say that it would be forbidden the entire day of the 16th with no Beit HaMikdash? Let's take a look.
It was brought very early in the morning anyway.
It was brought by Chatzot, but not first thing. My time, what's the reason that he said it's forbidden the whole day? Quickly the Beis HaMikdash should be rebuilt. And they'll say, if nowadays you start eating at daybreak of the 16th, then when the Beis HaMikdash is rebuilt, people will say, hey, last year we ate it when the first thing of the 16th, we had oatmeal of the new grain, first thing in the morning of the 16th. Actually, it's Pesach, so okay, whatever. We had the kosher Pesach oatmeal, we had matzahs, hashtanami nechel. So let's also now eat it the first thing of the 16th. The inu lo yadi, and they won't realize last year there was no Beis HaMikdash yet. Heir mizrach hitir. As soon as the east became light, as soon as the day broke, it became permissible. Hashta the ika Beis HaMikdash. Now that there is a Beis HaMikdash, omer matir. You need the actual bringing of the omer to make it permissible. So the Gemara says, all right. So that's why we can't eat it the whole day. So the Gemara says, the Ivni Amos. When are you afraid? You got to love these Gemaras that bring in the actual scenario of the Beis HaMikdash, talk about Zeichel HaMikdash being rebuilt for halachic analysis. When exactly are you concerned that the Beis HaMikdash will be rebuilt? In this scenario, that they might eat the Omer a little bit, they might eat the new grain a little bit too early. Ilema the Ivni B'shitzer. You're afraid that the Beis HaMikdash will be rebuilt on Chol HaMoed Pesach on the 16th of Nisan. Harei Heitir He'ar Mizrach. So if it was only built later in the day on the 16th, as soon as daybreak occurred on the 16th, when there's no Beis HaMikdash, the Beis HaMikdash wasn't built yet. It's going to be finished being built later in the day. So as soon as day broke, the new grain was permissible. So it wouldn't be a problem to eat it. And the assumption being that by the time, okay, so let's say Ella, so the Gemara says rather, the Ivni b'chamesa. So it was built on the 15th. It was built on Yantav itself. We'll talk about that in a minute. So the Gemara says, so meaning, or it was built any time other than the 16th. It was built 6 months ago. So, okay, if it was built earlier than the 16th, then at least you should be able to eat it from midday, meaning, why did the Gzeira have to be that you can't eat the new grain the whole day? Just say, wait till midday. Why? Because Hatznan, we taught in the Mishnah, Harachokim, people that live distant from Yerushalayim, Mutarim could eat the new grain, Mechatzos Yom Lahalan, starting at noon. Lefisha Ein Beisim Mitatzimbo, because Beisim was never lazy to allow the Omer to be brought later than noon. Beisim was always punctual to make sure the Omer was brought at the very, very latest by noon. So it says, look, make up your mind. If it's being built already on the 16th, so there wasn't time to bring it earlier. But you know what? As soon as day broke, it's going to be permissible. So you're concerned that it'll have been brought before, built before. So, okay, but then in that case, just have a practice not to eat it till noon, because we know that whenever that they made sure the Omer was always brought by noon. Why do you have to have a practice not to eat it the whole day? Whatever will happen in the future, just have a practice not to eat it by noon, and whatever will happen in the future, when God willing the Beis HaMikdash is rebuilt, you'll be able to eat it by noon. What scenario would you not be able to eat it by noon? 1 minute, let's see the Gemara. So the Gemara says, okay, look, tzricha, you need it for the following scenario. Here's a scenario where you won't be able to have eaten it where the Beis HaMikdash will be rebuilt, and that day you won't be able to eat it by noon. What's the scenario? The Ivni Belelia. It was built on the night leading into the 16th. Okay, or right before the sunset of the end of the 15th. Now, what's that scenario? So again, it's being built on Yontif and built at night, which I'll talk about in a minute. But if it's built at the end, right at the night leading into the 16th, so when day breaks on the 16th, you can't. It's not permissible because there's already a Beis Hamikdash. You have to wait till the Omer is brought. Fine, bring the Omer by noon. No, if you only built the Beis Hamikdash and finished it the night before, then you can't just wake up and decide we're bringing the Omer. In order to bring the Omer was a major process. They had to go out to the fields. They had to identify which wheat they were going to cut. They had to cut the wheat. They had to grind the wheat. They had to do 13 different processes of sifting it. So you needed lead time in order to get it done by noon of that day. So the concern is, if we say you have to wait till noon to eat it, the concern is the Beis Hamikdash will be rebuilt the night before of the 16th, and there won't be, and it'll be, because it'll be built, you'll need to wait till the Omer to be brought, but because it'll be built just the night before, there won't be enough lead time, and therefore it won't be ready by noon, and therefore we had to say, don't eat it the whole day. Pretty wild scenario.
If it's built in the morning.
If it's the morning of the 16th, and as soon as day breaks, then it's mutter immediately, because there's no Beis Hamikdash yet. If it was built on the morning of the 15th, then you have a whole day to get ready. But for this one scenario, we therefore have to not eat the whole day. It sounds quite wild. Now, by the way, Rashi and Tosfos both say, or Rashi really, Tosfos just repeats Rashi, I thought you're not allowed to build a Beis Hamikdash at night. I thought you're not allowed to build a Beis Hamikdash on Yontif. So if you take a look at Rashi, that's what Rashi's answer. So if you take a look at Rashi, you probably remember because Rashi said it. No. So Rashi, if you look at Rashi, look to the 2 lines from the bottom, he says, the Ein Binyan Beis Hamikdash Dochi Yontif, and also the line before he says he's not built at light. Which
Rashi?
I'm just 2 lines in the bottom of the Rashi. It's in the middle of a long Rashi. The future Beis Hamikdash that we're looking towards is already built and finished, and it's ready, and it's going to be revealed from heaven. That's going to be built by God, which is quite fascinating in general, because about this certain approaches towards redemption. Are you just waiting for it all to come from heaven? How much do human beings take a role in redemption? Nothing at all relevant to issues nowadays about Zionism and the roles that we have. But it's historically, it was actually true about, I know it's Purim time, but it was actually true about Hanukkah as well. The Hashmonaim were, and obviously were very righteous, but there were even like frummer people around that said, in the way, frummer, that said, God will redeem us. If God wants, salvation, then God is going to do it. And we shouldn't be playing a role in this.
Don't defend yourselves on Shabbos.
Well, that's true. So anyway, that's quite a fascinating explanation of this Gemara. Yes, Michael, you had a question.
I just thought it was interesting that they say because it's Beitin is not mitzvah. So when do you think the
Kohanim? Yeah, as we discussed in the past in Yomi and other places, the Gemara imagines that all of the things that went on in the Beis Hamikdash were ultimately under the auspices of Beis Din. So sort of imagines that the rabbis were sort of in charge of the Beis Hamikdash. Okay, so now the Gemara says like this. Rav Nachman bar Yitzchak Amar Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai Amar Rabbi Yochanan Zakkai b'shitas Rabbi Yehuda Amar. Actually, that's wrong. It's not a gezerah. When he says don't eat it the whole day, he's following the position of Rabbi Yehuda. The Amar Min HaTorah Hu Asur. It says biblically you're not allowed to eat the new grain if there's no omer the entire day. It's not like we've been assuming that it's allowed at daybreak. It's forbidden the whole day until the end of the day. Because the verse said, "At etzem hayom hazeh, you shall eat no grain until the essence of this day." Ad itzumo shoyom, until the very essence of the day. V'kasavar ad v'ad bichlal. And ad means up to and including. So the new grain is forbidden up until and including this very day. So the new grain is forbidden for the entire day. Okay, so therefore, because we don't say, no, etzem means the day itself, but up to the day or up to and including the day.
Yom hayom means the day. So etzem means something other than a whole day.
No, the entire day. But until, that means the very essence, the entire day. But the key is whether it's up to and including or up to and not including. So he says it means up to and including. So it's forbidden the entire day. Unless there's the omer, then it's permissible earlier. Which, by the way, there's a certain logic psychological power to that the bringing of the korban makes it permissible sooner, as opposed to the other approach where the bringing of the korban, the presence of the korban made you have to wait more. Here, the bringing of the korban makes it permissible sooner. So the Gemara says, does he really hold like him? But he argues on him. The Tanya we taught, or now we taught in the Mishnah, Mishachar Beis Hamikdash, he said Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai, Sheyehei Yom Anav Kulo Aser. Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai said the day of waving should be forbidden, totally forbidden. This is a different Mishnah, not ours. And Amar Rabbi Yehuda, and in that Mishnah, Rabbi Yehuda responded to him. Now he didn't really respond to him because he didn't live in the same generation. Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai was at the time of the Churban. Rabbi Yehuda was a student of Rabbi Akiva, so he was like in the year 150, 170, something like that. But Rashi says he's like responding to his position. So Rabbi Yehuda responded to this position and said, what do you mean it's rabbinically forbidden the whole day? It's a takana to be forbidden the whole day. Biblically, it's forbidden the whole day if you don't have an omer. Until the very day itself has passed. So the Gemara says, no, Rabbi Yehuda misunderstood what Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai was saying. Who's Savar Midrabanan? He thought Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai was saying rabbinically it's forbidden the whole day now that there's no Beis Hamikdash. Kamar. Veloi, that's not what he meant. Midoraisa Kamar. Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai meant now that there's no Beis Hamikdash, biblically it's forbidden the whole day. So the Gemara says, Vahitkin Kamar. But it says Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai established an edict, meaning established a new position. So it sounds like it is rabbinic. It doesn't sound like it's a biblical idea that it's forbidden the whole day. So the Gemara says, no. My hitkin, what does hitkin mean? Darash v'hitkin. It means he expounded the new law and established the practice. But he established a practice that he believed was a biblical practice. There had been a Beis Hamikdash, so nobody ever needed to know what was the halacha if there isn't a korban. Then the Beis Hamikdash was destroyed. So he expounded to the masses and taught them that now that there's no Beis Hamikdash, it's forbidden the whole day. But he wasn't teaching them a new rabbinic edict. He was teaching them what the halacha is. The halacha is without a Beis Hamikdash, it's forbidden the whole day. So at least that position, although it's a stretch on the word hitkin, makes a certain amount of sense. It makes sense, A, that the korban makes it permissible sooner rather than later, and it makes sense that you don't have to create some crazy scenario like the Gemara did, that we're afraid the Beis Hamikdash will be built dafka the night before, and that'll lead to a problem. Okay, because it's hard to understand what this issue is. What would be this concern that he would have to say, don't eat it the whole day? And according to this, it's a biblical halacha rather than a rabbinic concern. No. Okay, we'll do it when we learn Menachos. Yom Tov Rishon Shechal Yos b'Shabbos. Now, so we mentioned that the first day is biblical everywhere. The remaining 7 days are only in the Beit HaMikdash. Now we're going to talk about what will happen on the first day that falls out on Shabbos. Now we know we don't take the lulav on the first day that falls out on Shabbos. But in the Mishnah, both this Mishnah and the first opening Mishnah of the next Perek will say that they took the lulav when it fell out on Shabbos. Okay, what? That's what it should be.
Yeah.
Well, that's what it was. That used to be that they would take the lulav when Chol Hamoed fell out on Shabbos, they would not, because that would only be rabbinic. Or even in the Beis Hamikdash, they wouldn't do it because it would only be biblical in the Beis Hamikdash. But on the first day, which is biblical everywhere, they would take the lulav even when it fell on Shabbos. So let's read that. What? No, let's see what they did. You're not allowed to carry, but you would take the lulav. Let's see what they did. Yom Tov Rishon Shechal Yos b'Shabbos. The first day of Yom Tov falls out on Shabbos. Kol ha'molichin es lulaveim lebeis hakneset. Everybody would bring their lulavs to the synagogue. Again, fitting into the previous Mishnah that takes it for granted that the primary place in which you're taking the lulav is in synagogue during the Hallel. Right? Remember, just the previous discussion was, where do you do the nanuim? What if you came home and you didn't have a lulav in your hand? Oh, you can take it at home. But the basic assumption is you're taking the lulav in shul at Hallel. So what would you do if it's falling out on Shabbos? You can't carry it to shul on Shabbos. So you would go ahead and you'd prepare ahead of time. On Erev Shabbos, everybody would prepare and bring their lulavs to shul. L'machras, the next day, Shabbos morning, mashkimu mubayim, everybody would wake up early. We'll see why you want to be early. Because you would want to not have to go ahead and fight and deal with the crowds. So the early bird gets the worm, and I guess the early congregant gets the lulav. So you would go ahead and you'd recognize your lulav. Maybe you'd have you'd have it in a container with your name on it, and you would take it. Because the sages said, you can't fulfill your obligation with your your friend's lulav. So therefore, it's in shul because you had to prepare it from before Shabbos, and you have to recognize yours because you're only yotzei with yours. V'shayi mosachag, in the other days of the holiday, you can use your friend's lulav. Fine. But not on this day. So this day you had to identify yours, and it was already in shul. You weren't holding on to it from ahead of time. Rabbi Yossi says, Yom Tov Rishon Shachag Shechal Yot B'Shabbos V'Shachach V'Hotzi As HaLulav V'Reshut HaRabim. Let's say you forgot, you didn't leave your lulav in shul. This was the first day Yom Tov. It happened on Shabbos. Again, we're assuming people take the lulav on the first day Yom Tov, even on Shabbos. So you're taking your lulav, but you didn't bring it to shul ahead of time, and you accidentally walked out of your house with it. What? You got to go to shul in the morning, so you take your lulav off the table, you walk out of your house, and then you realize, oh my gosh, it's Shabbos, and I just carried on Shabbos. I have my lulav in my hand. So what's the halacha? Pater. You're not allowed to do it, but you're exempt from a korban because you took it out with permission. This is Rabbi Yossi's general position, which is actually, it's also the debate of Rabbi Eliezer and Rabbi Yoshua, of ta bidvar mitzvah. You were doing a mitzvah and you accidentally, not intentionally, accidentally did an aveira in the context of doing the mitzvah. And often it relates to Shabbos. You know you have to perform a bris milah, you're in Moel, it's the 8th day, and accidentally you give a milah to the wrong baby. Okay, you know you're supposed to take a lulav, and it's Yantiv on Shabbos, and this was at a time when they would take the lulav on Yantiv when it fell out on Shabbos, but you're doing the mitzvah of taking the lulav, but you accidentally walk out of your house. You didn't leave it in the shul ahead of time. So you're being toeh bidvar mitzvah, that exempts you from bringing a korban. Obviously, you're not allowed to do this chilul Shabbos, but if you accidentally did, the fact that you were being osek b'mitzvah exempts you from the obligation of the korban. Yes.
Didn't we see in Eruv there was some evidence that there was an Eruv in Yerushalayim back when?
Who says we're in Yerushalayim? Rabbi Yossi was in Lod.
Yeah, I'm talking about the when they were bringing him in the temple.
Oh, yeah. Oh, you mean why they have to bring it? Oh, that's a good question. If you're in Yerushalayim, why would you have to bring it to the temple? You could put it anywhere in Yerushalayim. Yeah, but this isn't necessarily Yerushalayim. We'll talk about that in the next mission. This is Beit HaKnesset, so this would be not necessarily assuming you have a walled city. Okay, Minani Mili. Where do you get this idea from? The difference between the first day and the rest of? Well, let's take a look. That there's a mitzvah to take it on the first day, and it has to be yours. This issue of ownership, something we've said before. Where do you get this from? Just how Rabbanan we taught. You shall take. Every individual has to take, as opposed to meaning one person takes for everyone. Now, this actually is interesting, and it's important to know in terms of hermeneutics the difference between the singular language and the plural language. If I said ulekachta as opposed to ulekachtem, singular or plural, you might think lekachta means you as an individual has to take. Lekachtem maybe means you as a community, and maybe one person can take for everybody. But basically, it's the exact opposite. The Gemara, for example, think about the mitzvah of counting. There are two mitzvahs of counting in the Torah. One mitzvah says, "Usfartem lachem imachrat hashabat miyom aviachem et omer tnufa shavashapatot tminot counting the omer. Usfartem b'lashon rabim, and the other one says, "V'safata lecha sheva shabatot sheva pamim," counting the years for the yovel. V'safata lecha, singular. Which one do we do as think is an individual obligation? Counting the omer. Which one is only an obligation on Beis Din? Counting the yovel. So actually the plural language means you, meaning all of you guys. It's in the plural. Every single one of you, all you guys, all you people, every one of you, that's the plural language. Usfartem lachem. V'safarta lechem, the singular, means the entirety of you as one corporate entity. I'm speaking to the whole room and I'm saying you in the singular, meaning you as one corporate entity. So therefore it's done by the Beis Din for everyone else. That's the counting of the yovel. As opposed to the plural language, which means all of you as individuals. So that's what the Gemara says. If it had said ulekachta lecha, one person could take the lulav for everyone. But lekachtem lachem means all of you as individuals have to take it. So that's the first point of shetei lekicha biyad kol echad vechad. Every individual has to take a lulav. Lachem, you, mishel lachem, it has to belong to you. Lahotzias hashov es hagazel, which excludes a borrowed or stolen lulav and esrog. Mikana muchachamim, here the rabbi said, Ein adam yotzei yedei chavasav yom tov rishon shachal lulav v'shal chavero. You don't fulfill your obligation with your friend's lulav, even if it's borrowed, certainly not if it's stolen, and that's by Yom Harishon, that's only on day one. Okay, Elim kei nasna lo b'matan, unless it's given as a gift. Umaisa, and then there's a story, Rabbi Gamliel, Rabbi Yoshua, Rabbi Eliezer, Rabbi Nazari, Rabbi Akiva, all these great rabbis, Shayu Baim Bisfina, they were traveling on a ship. There's actually interesting speculation about what they were traveling, because there was around that time, there was an intercession of rabbis with the Roman government, someone who associated with that. Anyway, the Lo Haya Lulav El Rebbe Gamliel Bavad. And Rebbe Gamliel was the only one who had brought a lulav with him. Lulav and esrog, it means, in the whole thing. You see, we're spending an insane amount of money, an obscene amount of money is not a new thing on the idea of lulav and esrog. He spent 1,000 zuz. Maybe he spent it because he had, it's like when you have to pay those highway bandit prices when you stopped at like a rest stop on the highway. Where else are you going to buy? Who else is selling lulav and esrogim on a ship? The one guy who had the lulav and esrog was selling it for 1,000 zuz. Anyway, not lo Rebbe Gamliel, the Yatzabas. Rebbe Gamliel took it and was Yotzei. V'nosno Rabbi Yoshua b'matana. He didn't lend it to Rabbi Yoshua. Because that would be Yotzei. He gave it to him as a gift. Not lo Rabbi Yoshua. Rabbi Yoshua took it. The Yatzabah was Yotzei, fulfilled the obligation. Then he turned around. So we're right now, right? It's Purim, and it's going to be Shalach Mana. So it's already the idea of regifting. Right, regifting was already in the thought of that way before us. Okay, so he regifted it to Rabbi Eliezer. The Yatzabah. Rabbi Akiva, and then Rabbi Eliezer ben Azariah gave it as a gift to Rabbi Akiva. Not lo Rabbi Akiva Yatzabah. Rabbi Akiva took it and was Yotzei, but they all gave it as gifts, not as loans. Zero to Rabbi Gamliel, and then Rabbi Akiva gave it back to Rabbi Gamliel, because you would expect Rabbi Gamliel would like to have his $1,000 lulav and esrog back. So the Gemara says, Lama li lameima zero. Why do you have to tell me he returned it? I mean, that was an interesting side note, but it's not halachically significant, is it? Yes, it is. It's telling us something in passing. Matana manas lahachzir shma matana. It wasn't just Rabbi Akiva out of the kindness of his heart gave it back. We're going to assume that the gift was originally given on the condition that eventually it get back to Rabbi Gamliel. And therefore, because Rabbi Gamliel wanted his $1,000 lulav back. So you could say, if you give me a gift on the condition that I give it back, it's not a gift, it's a loan. And maybe I'm not Yotzei. Right? No. Even if it's on that condition, it still is considered a gift. You have to fulfill the condition, but it is a status of a gift, and therefore you are taking something that right now is yours, and you are Yotzei. Well, that's a question. Like what Rava said, here's this esrog on the condition that you give it back to me. Not lo v'yatzabo, you take it in your Yotzei, because now it's yours. It can't be a loan, it has to be yours. Zero yatsa. If you returned it, you fulfill your obligation because you satisfied this condition. Lo zero, if you did not return it, lo yatsa, you did not fulfill your obligation. Why? Because if you didn't return it, then if the whole gift was a conditional gift and you didn't return it, it turns out that it was never a gift. So then when you were taking it, it was stolen. Right? It was only given to you as a gift on the condition that eventually you would return it. By the way, we see from this story that at least in Rabbi Gamliel's case, the condition wasn't that the first person returned it. The condition was that it be returned in the end. Whoever in the end has it, eventually it be returned. That at least was Rabbi Gamliel's condition. But that's an idea that you would have said, come on, give me a break. If that's what's going on, it's a loan, it's not a gift. And the Chiddush of Rava, which is being read into this story, is that no, it actually does constitute an actual gift, even though there is a condition. Now, there's other Gemaras that raise questions to what degree is it fully considered a gift or not, that Tosfos tries to work out, but this generally is our assumption. Michael asked the question about a case of Kiddush and other types of cases. All those cases get looked at, but this is at least our application here, and this is very relevant lahalacha, because somebody doesn't have a lulav and esrog and they want to borrow it on the first day of Yantiv, so you can just give it as a gift without saying, here's a gift amanas to tachzir on the condition, because hopefully people will sort of understand, like was probably the pshat of the story of Rabbi Gamliel, but also you can say it's matana manas lahachzir, and therefore you know that you're going to be yotzei. I think that's the second. I just want to say 2 points about Tosfos. If you look at Tosfos, it makes 2 interesting relevant applications. Tosfos says like this: the top Tosfos, he says, if it was a partnership esrog, you're also not yotzei. You have to be the sole owner. He says, and then like skipping like 4 lines down, he says, for like 5 lines under the word ella, he says, this is what they used to do in Europe. They would buy a lulav and esrog, everybody would chip it together, and they would all buy it with communal funds, because nobody could afford one by themselves. So he says, how does that work? If it's owned communally, you're not yotzei. You have to own it privately. So melamdi no san ki kulam nosen kol echad ve'echad chel kol lechaveru amanas lahachzir. The implicit stipulation is we own this communally, and when it's your turn to take it, where everybody else is giving it to you as a matana manas lahachzir, then you're done, and then you give it to Michael, and then everybody gives it to him as a matana manas lahachzir, and so on and so forth. So Tosfos says this, the reality was it was communal, but we have to assume there was some implicit or explicit stipulation that meant that people would own it individually when it was their turn. This plays out, by the way, when you take on a shul talis. Do you make a bracha or not? Because you don't make a bracha on a borrowed talis, and and how does it play out? And there's a similar idea. Well, the assumption is that if you take it and you want to use it to be yotzei, that the shul gives it to you as like a matana manas lahachzir or something, so that you can make the bracha. Anyway, it plays out interestingly in similar types of scenario. Talking about kiddushin, there used to be a ring. You ever go to the Jewish museums and you'll see these like big rings, like they're like these towers built on them or whatever. Anyway, they were used as communal wedding rings. Well, how do you use it? Since you have to own the ring that you're giving, and it was a similar type of a thing. It was owned by the community, but when it was your turn to use it, it became yours. So Tosfos number 1 just sort of like reflects that reality. I'll just read the rest of Tosfos. He says, since you purchased it for the purpose of everybody being yotzei, even though they didn't explicitly say when each person's turn it would be a gift to that person, it's assumed to be that was the implicit understanding and intent that we're operating with, that each person gets it when it's their turn. Now that being said, although Tosfos here just said we can sort of make it an implicit intent, the next Tosfos of here's your esrogah on the condition you return it to me has a whole problem, because there's other Gemaras that say that when you make stipulations, if you do something on the condition of X, that you have to satisfy a lot of technical conditions to make it a binding stipulation. Like you have to have, it's learned out from what's called Tanai b'nei Gad b'nei Reuven, the way when Moshe said, well, if you go in and you fight with your brethren, then you can come back and inherit this land on Eber Yarden. And in all of these ways, first he said, if this, then that, and if not this, then not that. He said a yes clause and a no clause, and he said the condition, and then he said the action, and there's all these requirements in order to make binding stipulations. And the question is, when do you need to satisfy those requirements or not? And Tosfos, so very often we say you don't really need to do it as long as it's implicitly your understanding and so on. Anyway, the next Tosfos suggests that maybe you have to make all those stipulations. If you look at just the beginning of the next Tosfos, he says, "B'shum makom ein medakte kashas b'lashono lahaktim tanai lemasev v'tanai kafel v'hein kodem lalav." Those are all the technical requirements of making conditions. That you have to first say the condition before the action. You have to double the condition. You have to say the yes clause before the no clause. That you would have to do all of that. But it's just not going into that detail. So this Tosfos says that yes, if you want to give something amanas lahachzir, you have to make sure you satisfy all of the technical conditions of making stipulations. Other Rishonim and at other times Tosfos says you don't have to satisfy all those conditions. That if it's that sometimes those can just be assumed to be your intention. And that's, by the way, what we see in the previous Tosfos, right? They bought this esrog in partnership, and he says even without saying anything, you can just assume that they wanted to operate with a certain type of parameters. So that's basically this idea of matam and naslahachzir, which, as I said, plays out really on Sukkot when you give them matam and naslahachzir on the first day, and can play out other ways about communal things that are shared, but that in order to be yotzei, you actually have to have complete ownership over. Yes, Michael.
Make a difference between to a katan, because can't they be konev and not makne?
Yeah, we'll discuss that later about whether amanas lahachzir just means the act of giving it back, or does it actually mean being makne back, and so on and whatever. We'll see that later. Gemara discusses the issue of a katan. Yes.
The idea of the talus, a communal talus, and a shul. So that's a choice you're making, right? Because like sometimes, like slichot,
or if you're just getting a aliyah and you put on the shul's talus or whatever, or you're getting up to daven and you're putting on the shul's talis, most people don't make a bracha. They just put it on. I mean, people, because you don't have to, right, take the ownership over it. That's correct.
Any problems with transferring ownership on Yom Tov?
Well, clearly not. You're allowed to. You're allowed to be makna things that are l'tzorach Shabbos and l'tzorach Yantiv. So that's normally a practice. For example, I'm going to your house and I'm going to give you, bring you over a bottle of wine or something. So if I'm real firm, I give it to somebody else and have them be koned for you, so you don't have to be koned on Shabbos. But the reality is that if what I'm giving you is something that you can use on Shabbos, and then I'm allowed to be makna to you on Shabbos. Okay, so now the Gemara says like this. Okay. Lamali l'meimar, shalachol belazuz. Why put? It's a very colorful story, but why do you have to point out that little detail that he spent $1,000 on it? So the Gemara says, lo diacha kama mitzvahs chavivas alein, to tell you how dear the mitzvahs were to them, how much money they were willing to spend just to be yotzei lulav and esrog. Amalei marbar meimer Rav Ashi. So marbar meimer said to Rav Ashi, Abba tzlui kematzi bei. My father, a meimar, when he would be holding on to his lulav and esrog when he was davening. I says, Meisvei, I'll ask you on that. Lo yochaz adam tefillin b'yado v'sefer Torah b'cheitav v'yitpalel. A person should not be holding tefillin in his hand, meaning not wrapped on his arm, but holding them in the palm of his hand, or a sefer Torah in his chest and daven, because you'll be distracted. You'll have to focus on holding on to them, and you won't be focusing on your davening. Or the reverse, if you focus on your davening, then you'll let them drop. V'lo yashkin bahem. If it's a separate point, you should not be urinating when you're holding on to your tefillin and sefer Torah. V'lo yishon bahem, and you shouldn't be sleeping, not only when the tefillin is wrapped on your arm, but even if you're just holding it in your hand. Lo shinas kever, lo shinas arai, not a permanent or temporary sleeping, because if you fall asleep holding on to the tefillin or sefer Torah, you'll drop them. V'amar Shmuel, and it's not just limited by the way. You'll say, well, maybe that's tefillin and sefer Torah. No, it's not limited to that. Shmuel also says, sakin v'kara, a knife or a plate, a dish, a kikar umaot, or bread or money, harei kiyotzebem, are the same issues. All these are things that you're afraid you're going to drop, even though they're not sanctified objects. You don't want to drop your knife on your foot. You don't want to drop a plate, it'll break. Right? You don't want to drop bread, it'll get dirty. So you see, if you're afraid you'll drop something, you can't hold it while you're davening. So how can you hold a lulav while you're davening? So the Gemara says, "Hasam lav mitzvah ninu v'tarid." There, you're not doing a mitzvah by holding on to these things, and therefore you're distracted. Hacha mitzvah ninu v'lo tarid. Here you're doing a mitzvah and you're not distracted, which is pretty funny. Although you're doing a mitzvah, why does it mean you're not distracted? You still don't want to drop your lulav and esrog. What makes you not distracted? So if you take a look at Rashi, Rashi says like this: Lav mitzvah ninu, about 8 lines from the bottom. La'uchzan, it's not a mitzvah to hold, and all these other things. V'avyin limasa, and therefore psychologically it's like a burden, it's a distraction. Therefore you're distracted because it is literally, the burden is heavy, but it's also like metaphoric, right? Psychologically it's a heavy burden. I got to be paying attention to holding on to this stuff. You're taking it, you're holding on as a mitzvah. You're like, you're thrilled to be doing this mitzvah. You don't, psychologically, it's not a burden, and therefore it's not distracting to you, which is again pretty funny. You got to be careful not to drop it, but somehow psychologically, if you're like thrilled to be doing it, then it actually somehow is not seen as a concern that holding on to it will serve as a source of distraction. Okay, so now the Gemara says like this, Tanya, we turn the Bryce up. This was the practice of the people of Yerushalayim. You'd walk out of your hand, you'd be holding on to your lulav. You go to the show holding on to your lulav. You're saying Kriyat Shema davening, even when you're davening, even when you're saying Shema, holding on to your lulav. Now, when you got an aliyah, or when you're Kohen and you did duchening, then you would put on the ground. Duchening, obviously, you need your hands free. But even when you're getting an aliyah, you have to roll the Torah open and close, right? You're not just getting an aliyah, you're reading from it, so you're closing it and opening it. So you need your hands free. Now you're done davening and show. What are you going to spend the rest of your day doing on Sukkot? You're going to do mitzvahs the rest of the day. So you're going to visit the sick and to console the mourners. Lulav b'yado, you come with your lulav. You see, this is the first sort of source of Chabad. You walk in, you're to the hospital. Did you take lulav and esrog yet? Okay, fine. Anyway, nichnas lebeis hamedrash. You go into the beis hamedrash. Mishager lulava b'yad benavu b'yad avdo b'yad shlucho. Then you send it home. Why do you send it home? Because now you're going to spend the rest of the day in the base medrash. So you don't want to leave it on the floor because that's not respectful. So then you get one of your servant or your kid to bring it home. Why don't you hold it with you? Because when you're learning, then actually it is a distraction. When you're interested, when you're davening, not, but when you're learning, it is. So anyway, my kamash. What does all this teach me? Lo dicho kama hayuz reason be mitzvot. How zealous or they were with the mitzvot. Now, part of the idea here is not just you're holding on to it. It wouldn't, for example, say, we never see like you should hold on to your shofar for the whole day of Rosh Hashanah, or go around all of Hanukkah holding on to like your Chanukiah. Because here, the holding on is actually the act of the mitzvah. Ulakaktem lachem. So you're just continuing to do the act of the mitzvah the whole day. Even though you're yotzei in that first moment, you're holding on to it as the continuation of the mitzvah throughout the day. Okay, let's read a little bit more. We have a little more time. Let's see if we can get to the Mishnah. Rabbi Yossi Omer Yantav. Now, Rabbi Yossi said that if you accidentally walk out of the house on again, this was assuming you would take it on Yantav that was on Shabbos, and you accidentally walked out of the house on Yantav Shabbos, you would be exempt from a sin offering because you were doing a mitzvah. Amar Abaye, said Abaye, Lo shanu elo shelo yatzabo. It's only true that you are exempt from your sin offering if you have not yet been yotzei, so you're still in the process of doing a mitzvah. Okay, aval yatzabo, if you're already yotzei when you took the lulav at home and then you stepped out of the house.
You're supposed to pick it up, though.
Well, that's about the question. Chayav. Then you are chayav a sin offering because you're no longer, in the process of doing a mitzvah. We just learned before you could still be doing a mitzvah, but once you've been yotzei already, you're no longer, distracted by the mitzvah, involved in the mitzvah. Once you're already yotzei, it's behind you, and you cannot. And the fact that you're still carrying it and still doing a mitzvah does not exempt you. So the Gemara says, well, what's the scenario then? How is it ever possible you weren't yotzei yet? As soon as you picked it up to step out of the house, you were already yotzei. So what do you mean? What's the scenario? You weren't yotzei yet. So Amar Abaye, Abaye says, Kisha hafacho. You turn it upside down. If you're carrying it, like we discussed earlier, you would turn it upside down before making the bracha. So you specifically picked it up in a way not to be yotzei because you're going to bring it to shul. You want to wait till you get to shul to make the bracha. So you picked it up upside down. So you haven't been yotzei yet. Rava says, and you only are yotzei when it's right side up, as we'll see later. Rava says, afilu tema shelo hafacho, even if you didn't turn it upside down, you're carrying it out in a lulav holder, and you're not yotzei because you're not holding it directly. So the Gemara says, Rava himself was the one who said, if you take it by holding it on with a handle, it's considered taking, even if you didn't directly hold it, through another thing is considered taking it. So even if you're holding it in a vessel, isn't it like taking it? So the Gemara says, Hani derech kavod. That's only if it's a respectful way of taking it. Avol derech bizayon, a disgracing way of taking it, lo amar. He would not say it. Lo, he would not say that. So now,
I guess you've never seen our
now the question is, what makes it disgraceful? Would you really take it out in a disgraceful? Meaning, there's a huge gap between kavod and bizayon. There's everything in the middle, which is neutral, right? When we take it out in our lulav holders, I wouldn't say it's bizayon. I wouldn't necessarily say it's kavod. It's just a convenient way of taking it. So with Rashi, it sounds more like it has to be kavod in order to be considered like as an act of taking. Rashi says if you're holding on to it with like a nice silk handkerchief or something, and you're using that as a handle to hold it, then it's considered like an act of taking. But if you're holding it in Rashi just as a kli, a vessel, it's not. A vessel isn't bizayon, but it's not kavod. So in order for it to be an indirect taking to count as an taking, it has to be something that is seen as a respectful way of doing it. So this is actually a very relevant question because when we learned Rava earlier, I think it was you who asked, right? So what about every time I walk out of my house? I got my esrog in my nice esrog box, which is right side up, the esrog, and I got my lulav in my lulav holder, which is right side up, and why isn't it l'kicha yidei davar achir? Why aren't I yotzei? Why can I make the bracha when I get to shul? Now, we do say even if you were yotzei, you can still make the bracha before you did the nanuim. We do hold like Rava. But it does seem that is considered not to be l'kicha derech kavod. That it's well, the Gemara didn't say you could, but you normally don't. You just take it, right? You just walk out of your house with it. So why? So anyway, so it does seem that the l'kicha derech kavod is defined narrowly. In most cases, would not be that scenario. Now, the question that Michael just said is, why didn't the Gemara give the answer about kavana? Why did the Gemara just say you didn't have kavana? Well, there's a debate whether mitzvahs need kavana. Lack of kavana, you still might be yotzei. Well, then Tosfos says, well, why did it say you have negative kavana? You had kavana not to be yotzei. So maybe in theory it could have said that, but again, that's also like harder to detect and to be obvious, and therefore, but that is always a possibility. Let's read a little bit further. The Gemara says like this. Look. Amar Rav Huna, Omer Hayi Rabbi Yossi, said Rav Huna, Rabbi Yossi, who said you're exempt, he was to say, Olas of Shenimsa Bein Agapayim, if you find a bird Ola between, Rashi says Agapayim just mean other dead birds by the foot of the altar, V'kasaver Chatasa Ofhi, and you assumed it's a bird brought as a sin offering. Now you're a Kohen, your mitzvah is to eat the sin offering birds, but the Ola birds have to be burnt. Now usually the Ola birds were in a different corner of the altar, on the floor of the altar, but it happened to be that because there was some overflow on one corner, this Ola bird is in the wrong place and it's with the Chatas birds. But you very reasonably assumed that it was a Chatas and you ate it. Va'achala, and you ate it. Pater, you're exempt. So the Gemara says, "My kamash malan." What is that teaching us? The tabid var mitzvah pater, that if you made an error when doing a mitzvah, you're exempt. Hainu hach. That's exactly what we've been teaching all along. The Gemara says, "No." Mao de Teima, I might have thought, Hasamhu de Tabidvar mitzvah patur, Hainu da Avad mitzvah. In our Mishnah, you made an error in a mitzvah, but eventually you actually was culminating in a mitzvah. You were going to take your lulav. Aval hacha here, de Tabidvar mitzvah, you made an error because you thought you were eating a chatas bird, v'lo avad mitzvah, but it didn't culminate in doing a mitzvah. You were planning on doing a mitzvah, but in the end, what you did was just an aveira, right? You understand the difference, right? In one case, you actually are in the process of taking lulav. It's just incidentally along the way, you're mechalul Shabbos. Here, you were wanting to do a mitzvah, but you were in the process of only doing an aveira, of eating an ola, not eating a chatas. So kamash malon, that doesn't matter, that even if you're planning, even if you didn't culminate in a mitzvah, you're still exempt from the sin offering. Meisvei, I'll ask you on this, Reb Yossi Omer, Hashochet as a tamid she'einu mevukar yochato, it's Shabbos, and you shecht an animal for a tamid, for the daily sacrifice on Shabbos, that was not checked 4 days before from blemishes, but Shabbos, and now even if it wound up, it had no blemish, if it did not go through the process of being pre-checked, you're not yotzei. And he says, chayiv chatos. Wow. You have to bring chatos. It's the same Rabbi Yossi, who normally says if you're doing a mitzvah, you're exempt if you accidentally violate Shabbos. V'tzarich tamid achir, and obviously you have to bring another tamid. That's the whole point. You weren't yotzei. So how do you explain that? So maybe it's because you didn't in the end do a mitzvah, but you just got through saying that even if it didn't culminate in a mitzvah, you're still exempt. So Amalei bar minei dahi, forget that example. The Itmar Allah was said on it. Amar Rav Shmuel bar Chitai, Amar Rav Hamnuna, Saba, Amar Rav Yitzchak bar Ashayin, Amar Rav Huna, Amar Rav. So the whole tradition named Rav going to Hivio milishka sheina mevucharim. You brought it from the chamber of sheep that were not pre-checked sheep, which basically means it was your own fault. That was a real negligence. You can't say you were distracted and preoccupied in the doing of a mitzvah and you should be let off the hook. Because number one, not only in that case did you not end up doing a mitzvah, which maybe you could still get off the hook, as we said, but also you were highly negligent in the fact that you wound up doing the wrong thing. And therefore, that by itself, or the combination of the two, of not culminating a mitzvah and that degree of negligence, that cannot exempt you. Okay, Chag Sameach, everyone.